Now, in that last speech, I think we heard a great deal of bluster, but there was, I think, a marked note of absence, or of substance. Let me turn first to that first contention about the four facts: the burial, the empty tomb, the appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. Now here, Dr. Ehrman says, I have dubious use of modern authorities. I agree that the citation of modern authorities doesn't prove anything in and of itself. That's why I gave the arguments under each of the 2 points. He has to deal with the arguments. He says that I represent a minority opinion, not about those four facts. I said that it is controversial whether the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of those facts. But I can give him the names, the evidence for people who hold to those four facts. That does represent the broad mainstream of New Testament scholarship. Insofar as Dr. Ehrman now chooses to deny the honorable burial, the empty tomb, the appearances, he is in the decided minority of New Testament scholarship with regard to those facts. Secondly, he says, I have dubious use of ancient sources. For example, he says Paul was 25 years later, not as early as I had claimed. But surely Dr. Ehrman knows that Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, is quoting an ancient Christian tradition which he himself received, and that goes back to within 5 years after the crucifixion. In fact, James D.G. Dunn dates it back to within 18 months of Jesus' death. So we're relying on these pre-Pauline traditions here, not the date of Paul's actual letter. He also says perhaps Paul was talking about a communal burial. Not when you look at that four-line formula in 1 Corinthians 15. It is like an outline of the events of the death of Jesus, the burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the empty tomb, and then the appearance narratives. Compared to the Acts on the one hand of the apostles and the Gospels on the other hand, this summary in 1 Corinthians 15 is like an outline of that, which includes as the second line, Joseph's burial of Jesus in the tomb. Dr. Ehrman also says that, is it true that unembellished narratives are more likely to be historical? I would say yes, that this is what his own wish list included, that the earlier the narrative, the better. Similarly, less embellished has a better claim to historical credibility. Third, he said, I make dubious assertions. For example, the women at the tomb, he says they're placed there by Mark because they are paradigmatic outsiders. That's nonsense. These women are followers of Jesus, particularly Mary Magdalene is one of the disciples of Jesus. So you can't explain why they would appear in the narratives because of that. Moreover, as I said, this is independently attested. So he's assuming Mark is the only source. But we've got at least 5 independent sources for the empty tomb story and the women's involvement there. So that simply won't work. Same with Joseph of Arimathea. I'm not inferring it on the basis of Paul. We have multiple independent sources for Joseph's involvement with the burial. And Dr. Ehrman himself uses that criteria over and over again in his own work on the historical Jesus to establish historicity. He says then, number 4, that I draw dubious inferences. For example, that because Paul says Jesus appeared, therefore there is an empty tomb. I never made such an inference, either tonight or in my written work. Rather, in my written work, my argument was that when Paul says, and he was buried, and he was raised, no first century Jew would wonder, but was the body still in the grave? For a first century Jew, it is the remains of the person in the tomb that are raised to new life. Jewish belief in the afterlife was a physical belief in the resurrection of the body or the remains, primarily the bones. And that's why Jews preserve the bones of the dead in ossuaries for the resurrection at the end of the world. So it is that 4-line formula that implies the existence of an empty tomb, and no first century Jew could have thought otherwise. But certainly, just saying that Jesus appeared doesn't in and of itself mean that it was physical. But notice that Paul did distinguish between the resurrection appearances of Jesus and mere visions of Jesus. And I would challenge Dr. Ehrman to give any explanation of the difference between a vision of Jesus, such as, say, Stephen saw, and a genuine resurrection appearance of Jesus, which soon ceased, other than the fact that the ones were extramental in the external world, physical, where the others, the visionary ones, are purely intramental. So the bottom line, I think, is that Dr. Ehrman has not been able to invalidate any of the arguments that I've given for those 4 facts. They are all established by the very criteria that Dr. Ehrman uses in his own work. Multiple attestation from independent early sources, and the criterion of dissimilarity or better embarrassment. Now, what about that second contention, that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation? He didn't respond to my argument other than to just say, in a sort of hand-waving way, that there's no mathematical evidence for what God does in the world. And of course, that wasn't my point. My point was that he cannot say that the resurrection is improbable simply because miracles are improbable relative to the background information. You've got to look at the full scope of the probability calculus, and he has failed to do so. In particular, his view is self-contradictory because he says the historian can't make judgments about God. And if that's the case, then he cannot say the resurrection is improbable because the resurrection is the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, he seems to suggest that the historian can't make these sorts of inferences because somehow God is inaccessible. Well, I have a couple of points I'd like to make here. First, you don't need to have direct access to your explanatory entities in your hypotheses. Think of contemporary physics, for example. Contemporary physics posits all sorts of reality to which the scientist has no direct access. Strings, higher dimensional membranes, even parallel universes which are causally disconnected from ours. But they postulate such unobservable entities on the basis of the evidence that we have as the best explanation. Secondly, notice that the historian doesn't have direct access to any of the objects of his study. As Dr. Ehrman says, the past is gone. It's no longer there. All we have is the residue of the past, and the historian infers the existence of entities and events in the past on the basis of the evidence. And that's exactly the move that I'm making with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. But finally, number three, this isn't a debate about what professional historians are permitted to do. That would be a debate about methodology, about the rules of professional conduct. This is a debate about whether or not there's historical evidence for the resurrection. And even if the historian is professionally blocked by some methodological constraint from inferring the resurrection of Jesus, you and I aren't so blocked. We're not so constrained. Nor would I say is the historian so constrained in his off hours, for example. It would be a tragedy and a shame if we were to miss the truth about the past, about Jesus, simply because of some methodological constraint. Finally, as for Apollonius of Tyana and Henny, the circle drawer, let me simply quote from Robert Yarborough, who points out that these figures did not have any kind of evidence prior to the 1st century, the time of Jesus. Apollonius of Tyana is a 3rd century figure who isn't even mentioned prior to the 3rd century. Similarly with Hanina Bendoza and Honey the circle drawer, John Meyer, Ben Witherington have shown that these have little relevance to the 1st century situation of Jesus. So these, I think, are simply invalid comparisons. I would like to address those 3 questions that he gave me, but I see that the timekeeper is holding up the stop card, so perhaps I can get to those in the Q&A period.